Now we're going to move on to understanding and creating the healthy family system. We spent last session talking about all the problems in the addicted family, so we're going to move on to talking about some more positive tools, tips, techniques that we can use. We'll identify characteristics of healthy relationships, review common concepts related to assertive communication, explore behaviors needed to sustain recovery, and define goals and objectives for the family recovery process. So healthy relationships. And I started out doing a Google search for healthy relationships just to see what was out there. There's a lot of garbage. There's a lot of things that are redundant. They have lists that are like 40 items long, and they say the same thing 6 or 7 different times. I pared most of what I read down to the following 3 things, or the following 7 things. Honesty with self and others. Faith and trust in self and others. Compassion, guess what? For self and others. Respecting opinions and boundaries. Openness and willingness to even engage another person. Openness and willingness to even consider another person's ideas. The willingness to provide mutual support. And relationships really need to be a give and take. You know, if one's always taking, then it's not really a healthy relationship. And if there's neither, there's never a give or take, it's just kind of a passing, that's an acquaintance. An unconditional positive regard. Accepting, appreciating, loving, caring for, whatever word you want to use, the person for who they are, not what they do for you, and not what they do in general. So, if this person quit being a radio disc jockey, would you still like them if they couldn't get you free tickets to concerts anymore? Whatever the case may be. We need to help people look at these. And we want to identify 3 activities families can do to enhance each of these qualities. And this is actually an activity you can do either in your group with your patients, participants, or with the family group, or both. Have them just go through each one. What are 3 ways you can enhance honesty in your family with self and others? One of the things I heard one time was having a confession jar. If you did something wrong, you could put it in there, and then it would get reviewed, but you weren't having to go up and tell somebody what it was you did wrong and then wait to figure out what their reaction was. You know, they got to read it, decompress a little bit, and then they addressed it. Honesty with self, journaling, writing in diaries, artistic stuff, just talking, setting aside family time every day, just to talk with one another. Oh my gosh, no televisions, no radios, no iPads. There was one activity that I saw that was actually pretty funny. At the dinner table, there were no iPads allowed. Any mobile devices, iPhones or whatever, had to be turned over. The first one to turn his or her phone over had to do all the dishes. I'm like, I could get away without answering a text for a little while. So there are creative ways to encourage people to engage with one another. And it doesn't always have to be the whole family. It can be, you can pair up. My daughter and I, about once a month, have a girls' day. And we'll go out and just kind of have fun. We don't do anything in particular, but it's time for us to spend together where we can talk, and if she wants to say anything, she can. Faith and trust, that's a little bit harder to come up with fun activities for. How do you develop trust in one another? You can do the trust exercise where you fall backwards, which is always really funny, but generally when you do it with siblings, they let the other person fall. I've seen it happen. In practice, as a team building activity in corporate America, I really hate ropes courses. They're really awesome. They do what they're supposed to do. I just don't like going out and getting sweaty and being all up in my coworkers' business. But ropes courses, or they can make their own ropes courses in their own backyard to solve problems, encourages family communication and encourages faith and trust. And, okay, I'm going to have faith that you're thinking through the next right thing here. Just talking about it. Compassion for one another. That involves being emotionally available. Knowing what matters to different people. Respecting opinions and boundaries. A lot of times that's just talking about things, but sometimes you can put a hot topic, if you will, out there and have people discuss it at the table, preferably not over dinner, because then somebody ends up with indigestion and somebody else ends up checking the phone. But it encourages people to maybe discuss differing opinions without getting upset or overly taken aback by what's going on. Openness and willingness. Encourage people to just go with the flow sometimes. That openness and willingness, when we do Girls' Day Out, I'm not an impulsive person. I like structure. But on Girls' Day Out, I say, Saturday, or Sunday, or whatever the day is, you've got the floor. We're going to do whatever you want to do. So I'm being very open, and very willing, and very trusting that we're going to go do things that she thinks are fun, and we're going to have a good time, and that kind of thing. Providing mutual support. That also involves asking for support, because we don't want to expect mind reading. And unconditional positive regard. Mutual support and UPR kind of can go together sometimes. I remember when I was studying for my MHSP exam, my daughter, who was only 8 at the time, was going around the house and leaving little notes on my pillow and in my study books. You can do it, Mommy. Or you're going to pass. And she left 3 or 4 notes around, which I'm not a note-leaving person. I'm not one of those. That's just not me. So she didn't get it from me. That was not something she learned, but she spontaneously decided that was a good way to express mutual support and unconditional positive regard. If you fail, so what? I was freaking out about that test a little bit because the practice tests were ridiculously hard.
It's just in a different format than we're used to taking.
It is, and in my experience, little diatribe, was that it involved no clinical judgment. And that was the big thing that people kept telling me. They're like, take it as if you just walked out of your graduation ceremony and you had never worked with a client. Because I was reading way too much into it. Okay, healthy relationships. And this explanation works with grown-ups as well as younger kids. We talk about chocolate chip cookies. And that generally gets people's attention, especially if there are chocolate chip cookies available. Sugar cookies are good. Chocolate chips are good. I've made a meal out of them before. I know. Independently, they can both be a dessert. Independently, they are both an edible food. They can stand on their own merits. You put them together and you make chocolate chip cookies, you've got something different, but also whole. When we talk about relationships, we don't want to take 2 incomplete people and try to smush them together and make something complete. We want to have 2 people who are whole and not relying on the other one for their mere existence, and make something completely new and exciting. So we need to know that, and I have people identify who's the chocolate chip in the relationship and who's the sugar cookie. But both of them have their own unique qualities. So we go through in the activity and we list what are the unique qualities of sugar cookies and how can they be used in desserts. And then we talk about chocolate chips and vice versa. Then we talk about when you put them together and you make chocolate chip cookies, and usually the first thing somebody says is chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream. And I'm like, oh yeah, that works for me. But people start getting the idea that you want two complete people. So what is it that you don't want? Just cocoa, because just plain cocoa's nasty. Like just eating plain flour. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't put cocoa and flour together and go, here's a dessert. So we want to have people start with a healthy relationship with their self. They need to be internally validated. They need to know that they're okay just as they are. They need to have self-respect. I'm okay. These are my boundaries. These are my values. These are my opinions. And that's okay. And self-awareness of what their boundaries and opinions and feelings are. This is usually like the first 3 months of therapy, just getting to this point. And they need to have a relationship with self where they're willing to take care of themselves. Just knowing what you need, what you feel, what you like is only part of the battle. You actually have to be willing to be proud of that, be respectful of that, and take care of that. One of the first things that, or one of the easiest, if you will, ways to help people start down that path is assertive communication. Have them start communicating with themselves and with others. You know, with the advent of the Bluetooths and everything, now people can walk around and talk to themselves and nobody knows if you're on the phone or you're just talking to yourself. But I remember one day I looked outside and one of my staff members was walking around in the courtyard having a very animated discussion. And this was early in the Bluetooth genre, so it didn't click right away that she had a Bluetooth on. And I was like, oh, we got a problem. And then I went out and I realized that she had her thing on. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. In assertive communication, people make eye contact. You don't want people looking at the ground. But it's also helping people learn what amount of eye contact. We've all had those people that will make eye contact and they'll stare right through you and you're just like, okay. It's a new concept for people. And especially if you're talking about something you're ashamed of or you're not sure will be approved of or whatever the case may be, you may not make as much eye contact. So encouraging people to make comfortable levels of eye contact. Watch your tone and volume. When we get nervous, angry, agitated, we tend to talk faster and louder. Now that has to be normalized for the person. By nature, I talk fast and loud. So I have to get really, really loud in order for it to be like out of control. Have the person understand how their tone and volume impacts other people, though. Because if they tend to be loud, my mother is also very loud, and I remember when my son was little, she would start laughing, and every time she'd start laughing, he would startle and then start to cry. He's like, ah! But it wasn't, her fault. He was just, little. But it's important to understand that's an exaggerated response. Understand how your tone and volume impact other people based on their prior learning experiences. He had none, so he didn't know how to perceive that. If somebody comes from a very violent family, a very aggressive family, they're going to perceive something differently who's loud and animated than maybe somebody who comes from an Italian family. Think and talk about yourself positively. If you can't say something nice, don't say it at all. Self-deprecation, what's the point? If you're fishing for compliments, maybe you need to look internally and give yourself compliments and not rely on other people to give them. Eliminate adding qualifying statements to your opinions or requests. You might think this is crazy, but, or yada yada. The sky is blue today, I guess. Oh, it might rain, but that's just my opinion. It hedges everything. And reducing tag questions. So you make a statement. I went home and I was just completely exhausted after having to deal with all those customers last night. Does that make sense? Yeah, probably. You're not crazy. Those two things, and I can't take credit for this. I learned it from a baby shower, actually. We would keep clothespins in the room. And during group, anybody who would add a qualifying statement or add a tag question would get a clothespin. And whoever had the least clothespins at the end of group got some sort of prize, reward, got to leave early. In residential, it was very uncommon to be allowed access to actual sugar-sweetened iced tea. So that was generally a huge reward. If somebody could go into the cafeteria and get a glass of iced tea, oh my gosh. You made their week. But it was also a way to point it out to the person and everybody would laugh. Wouldn't do it during therapy groups. It was obviously just during psychoeducation because that wouldn't be real appropriate if somebody's in crisis and boohoo crying and go, do you understand what I'm thinking? Here's a clothespin. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to when you do it, but it is an enlightening exercise because I think a lot of us don't really realize how often we qualify our statements. And oh yeah, we'll get to my favorite one in a minute. Consciously taking responsibility for yourself and avoiding blaming. That's another one that you can do the clothespin for. You can put like 5 rules up on the board, and whenever anybody breaks one of those rules, they get a clothespin. Avoid taking responsibility or making excuses for other people. Other people are really good at coming up with their own excuses. Take responsibility for your role in something and let the other person take responsibility. Most of the time in the addicted family, the addict blames and the enabler takes responsibility. So either way, not good. They want to take responsibility for their own stuff, not that of the other. Eliminate should, ought to, and have to, and replace it with I choose to. Typical cognitive behavioral thing, but it's amazing how making that tiny little adjustment in your dialogue actually changes your attitude.
Sure does.
And I've tried it myself. I try most of the time to use I choose to instead of I should. I use should more than I should. But using that is much more empowering because it implies there's a choice, which there is. Eliminating but. Now, I used to say just eliminate but. And then I had one client who picked up on that and replaced it with however. So I had a really good day today. However, I'm expecting the sky to fall. But and however mean the same thing most of the time when they're used. Whatever came before it is irrelevant. So try to eliminate those 2 words, or if you're going to use them, understand the meaning. Sometimes but is perfectly appropriate. I choose to go to the grocery store today, but first I need to go to the hairstylist. Well, it doesn't really negate that you need to go to the grocery store. It's just saying I'm going to flip-flop the order. So sometimes it's appropriate. It helps clients identify their self-negating talk when they start paying attention to that, though. And people are entitled to their own opinions, thoughts, feelings, and reactions. Not in my clinic, because I'm right all the time. That's the opinion or the air that we sometimes give off when we do groups. We're right. We're the therapist. We're the leader. And controlled or moderated drinking, you're crazy. People are entitled to their opinions. If they think that it'll work for them, it may. It's worked for some people. Now it's few and far between. Let's look at the objective evidence. We need to be willing in our groups to encourage people to have and voice their own opinions and talk them through. And if at the end they still hold on to their thought, feeling, opinion, reaction, that's fine. You don't need to elaborate upon or justify any response you give. The lower the self-esteem, the more the justification. As people become more self-confident and feel less like an imposter, they feel less like they've got to justify and annotate and cite everything they say because their opinion and their thoughts are valid. They don't have to quote Benjamin Franklin or Dr. Phil or whoever. Give as much information as you feel comfortable in response to a question, which goes along with ask open-ended questions. We need to be cognizant of how often we ask yes and no questions if we're actually looking for an answer. My mother gets frustrated because she'll be on the phone with my kids and she'll ask yes or no questions. And they give her a yes or no answer. And she's like, they don't want to talk to me. I'm like, you asked a yes or no question. So she's had to work at asking open-ended questions in order to engage a dialogue because apple doesn't fall too far from a tree. I had the same time when I did my comprehensive exams. They asked a question, I answered it. And I was like, okay, I answered it in like a paragraph, but I was allotted 3 pages. What else am I supposed to say here? So my committee chair sat down with me for a little while. He's like, you need to elaborate. Why? So we do need to ask open-ended questions and ask questions that we want to know the answer to. If we find that we're getting frustrated because we're not getting enough information, first we say, do we have trust established, yada, yada, yada. But then we also have to say, are we asking for the information that we're expecting? If we want to know, tell me about your history of drug use. That's a little too vague. You know, most people are like, started using when I was 19. I have a $1,000 a day habit now. What else do you want to know? We need to provide some prompts. We also don't want to say, unless we just want a yes or no answer, something like, were you abused as a child? That's a yes or no question. People are not going to say, generally, yes, my father abused me from the time I was 6 until I was 14 and I ran away. They're not going to say that. Shut up and listen. Americans, as a culture, and I'm not familiar enough with other cultures to add them to the list, we are so busy figuring out our response to whatever somebody has to say that we don't hear what they have to say. As soon as we shut our mouths, we're thinking of our response, which really causes problems in communication because you don't hear. You may hear bits and pieces, or you may hear the words but miss the meaning. Practicing listening can be an entire group activity. You can do different scenarios, different acting situations to help people understand or see how much they miss when they don't pay attention, and help them also understand why they don't listen, because they don't want to hear. They're too busy defending themselves because they feel like they need to defend themselves. Now, there are some people with impulse control issues that they don't have the ability to put on the brakes and listen without being medicated or without really consciously practicing thinking about that. Most children, yours probably were the same way when they were little. They go through that phase where they have to interrupt because they can't wait. They've just got to tell you now. And you're on the phone and they're pulling on your dress, or you're trying to make dinner and they're like, but I got to tell you, I got to tell you, I got to tell you. When you're 6, it's a little annoying. When you're 26, it's a lot annoying. Going with that, and it's one of the hardest skills that I had to learn in training, was being okay with silence. If somebody takes a breath, wait for a second to see if they're done talking or they just needed to take a breath. One of the ways you can demonstrate this and improve communication is paraphrase as you lead in, which, that's kind of what we're trained to do. I can see why you're feeling overwhelmed with everything you have to do. And then I'll add my thoughts to it. That way the person can go, no, I'm not overwhelmed, or I think you missed the point. It gives them an opportunity to correct you. It also forces you to listen. You can do activities where you go through the different levels, level 1 through level 5 of paraphrasing. I personally have found that those activities didn't really go well in group. It was too clinical, too boring. Could have been the way I did it, no doubt. So if you have a way of helping people practice paraphrasing that they enjoy, one activity that I have used before, and we haven't done the different levels, but I've taken a show like The Simpsons or some other comedy type show, nothing that's too dramatic or triggering, and we'll play little excerpts, and then I'll have people try to paraphrase what the person was saying. Or back when Jerry Springer was on, talk about triggering, we would hear whoever it was that was on the Jerry Springer show talk for a little while, and then we would pause it and we would talk about what we heard. And generally people had 2 or 3 different interpretations of what they had heard. So we talk about how is it that we all heard the same words, but we came up with different interpretations. It was somewhat amusing. They liked watching Jerry Springer. It helped hone in listening skills. They also were able to talk about and articulate at that point what they were picking up from nonverbals. Because we don't normally say, well, I saw this person was twisting their ring around. We see it, we recognize it, we interpret it. But we really broke the different things down to see what was being identified. You statements distance you from your feelings, thoughts, and actions, and often put other people on the defensive. You made me feel. Not only am I distancing, I'm blaming. Typically in groups, I discourage you statements and encourage everybody to start whatever they're going to say with an I statement. What I hear you saying, what I feel, or my reaction to. Because then they're taking ownership, they're not blaming, and they're also making themselves a little bit more vulnerable. If I'm saying you, then I'm standing behind the barrier throwing stones. If I say my reaction to, then I've walked out and taken off the Kevlar a little bit. Talk about behavior, not the person. Couples counseling. This is like couples counseling 101. He's such a slob. Or she doesn't pay any attention. I can't quantify that. I don't know what that looks like. How am I going to know if she's paying attention or if he's not being a slob? Because that's not descriptive. What behavior is it that you see that is bothersome? Be as specific as possible, identifying observable and measurable things. Not only does this kind of go to the unconditional positive regard, because you're not attacking the person, you're addressing a behavior. So it also leaves people so they don't feel as much on the defensive. Use a criticism sandwich. A positive statement, a constructive statement, and a positive statement. Whenever I would do performance evaluations, I would start out, before we even brought out the paperwork to review it, with a summary of all the good points that I had seen. And some of my staff, who tended to be more perfectionistic, we would talk ahead of time about what it meant to not get perfect fives. And I would explain to them that nobody gets perfect fives, because that's not realistic. Nobody's perfect. And my boss would kick it back. We would talk about what they could do to improve. Now, most of my staff averaged 80% fives, 15% fours, and maybe 5% threes. Very rarely did I have somebody who, by the time we got to performance appraisal, had perpetuated a behavior long enough to be at a 1 or a 2. But we were still talking about behaviors. And if I had to put somebody on a performance improvement plan, just like we do with kids when we ground them, or when, we identify behaviors. These 3 things need to change. And these are the consequences if they don't. These are the rewards if they do. And then I would finish up the evaluation, again, with a summary of all the good points, how the person has grown, how I appreciated their loyalty. And I try to find a few things that they did do well, because if they were still employed, they were probably doing things overall pretty well. And learn to discriminate between something that's your problem from something that's their problem. When people are having problems, sometimes it's the other person's perception or reaction. Maybe my mom's second husband was habitually tardy. I mean, really tardy, 45 minutes, an hour late. And she would get so frustrated and angry and felt dismissed and, all those things, which, you can understand culturally in our society. If somebody's regularly an hour late, it's like, dude, what's up? From his culture, it was kind of a laissez-faire. If I say I'll be there at 4, sometime between 4 and 6.
Is he Latin?
Italian. But it was a different perception. So he didn't perceive it as a problem. So he was like completely clueless why she was getting upset. So discriminate between something that's your problem from something that's their problem. He's not being disrespectful. You're putting all these interpretations onto it. Eventually, she learned just to tell him 2 hours ahead of time, and then he'd usually get there on time. So if they were going to go to an 8 o'clock movie, she'd tell him to be ready at 5. It worked. Should you have to do that with a grown-up?
Whatever works.
Whatever works. And again, that was a cultural thing, that he'd never been raised to be military punctual. Behaviors needed to sustain recovery. So assertive communication and self-care and honesty with oneself and awareness and all those things are great. But in order to sustain those, people need to perceive it as something that is somewhat within their control. Can I have a healthy relationship? Is this somewhat within my control? Can I talk to this person without it ending up in a screaming match. If they don't perceive that it's within their control, they're probably not going to try. They're still going to avoid. Is addiction, is recovery somewhat within my control? Well, hopefully, by the time we get down to this slide, they believe it is. So what parts are within your control and what parts aren't? Is it a challenge? If something's too easy, we put it off and we don't pay attention to it. When people are on their pink cloud, and sometimes when they've been in recovery for a couple years, they start getting slack. It's not a challenge anymore to stay clean and sober, so they slack off on their meetings, they slack off on their journaling, and before they know it, bam, the relapse came from out of the blue. So we want it to be enough of a challenge to motivate people to stay engaged, and we want it to be worthwhile, important enough for them to commit to it. One of the things we usually talk about at length, repeatedly, is going to meetings. Is that within my control? Yes. I can choose to go. I can choose not to go. I can choose which one to go to. I can choose to go to a big book study or an open meeting or an online meeting. There are a lot of choices I have. So yes, it's somewhat within my control. Is it a challenge? The challenge is getting something out of each and every meeting. And that I phrase to people as, my challenge to you is when you come out of that meeting, identify, write down between 1 and 3 things that you got out of that meeting and how it applies to you now. You may be in there for an hour and a half and only get one thing out of it, but you got one thing. So why was it worth your time? And commitment. Sometimes we go to the gym and we hit a plateau, and no matter how hard you work, you can't run any faster, you can't lift any heavier weight, but you keep going. Why is it worth that commitment? Likewise with recovery, why is it worth the commitment to get up every morning, take your morning inventory, go to meetings, etc.? Decisional balance exercises are great. With the advent of mobile devices, a screensaver that is meaningful is also, a good reminder, because every time their phone rings or something, I have my daughter on mine, and every time I see it, I'm like, oh, isn't she cute? I'm a mother. I've got to be biased, but encouraging people to put stimuli in their environment that remind them why it's worth the effort. Honesty, this is the first one to go, and you would probably believe it. What I've seen, or what I interpret, is that honesty with self goes long before honesty with other people. I start lying to myself about what's okay, what's not okay, what I need, what I don't need. Which tells me, the therapist, that person doesn't have very much respect for themselves. If the first thing to go is self-honesty, that means they're putting other people, they respect other people more and put other people's needs above theirs, which sets up a really bad cycle of potential codependency. The other thing to talk about is, how can you keep something challenging? Going to the gym. You can only go to the gym and run on the treadmill for so many days in a row before you look at the treadmill and you're like, really? I've done every program. I don't know what else to do anymore. You've got to keep it challenging. Maybe go out and run on the road, or run backwards, or I don't know. Recovery is the same way, as are relationships. People get complacent in their relationships. They start taking each other for granted. They're committed to the relationship. They're there, but they're not engaging the other person. They're just kind of like two ships in the night. I remember when my husband and I were looking for houses, we would be sitting in the same room. He'd be in his easy chair, I'd be in mine, and we would be texting each other links to different Zillow listings. A word not spoken. It was just, and it struck me as interesting as that we had gotten to that point. I mean, he would get it, he would look at it, and then if it was something he felt worthy of commenting on, he would comment, and if he didn't comment, I'd be like, okay, well, that one flopped. But in our day of mobile devices, I think we've gotten more complacent about communicating with each other and attending to the physical, emotional, and spiritual needs of one another. We talk a lot at each other. So helping people figure out what in their relationships they can control, why it's worth the commitment, and how to keep it a constant challenge to grow together, communicate, whatever their particular hurdles happen to be. Openness kind of goes along with honesty. Once you're honest with yourself, then you need to be willing to share, because people can't help you if you don't let anybody in. And openness to new ideas, new thoughts, new things. Persistence, willingness, and dedication. Keeping on, keeping on. Again, it's not always fun, but trying to figure out ways to make it interesting. I don't want to say make it a game, because this is people's life. It's not really a game. But keep it interesting and keep people engaged. Some people will do self-help workbook after self-help workbook after workshop, because they enjoy continuing to learn about themselves and about other people. We've probably all met somebody who is your perpetual student. They just love to learn. They perceive it as a challenge to learn new things, to get A's on tests, to get new knowledge. And there's a commitment because there's something about it that's rewarding. So we always want to come back to these three things and make sure if somebody is starting to relapse, faltering in their dedication, which one of those three is going away? And patience with others, with life, and with yourself. And this can be everything, and going back to you've got to decide if it's your problem or somebody else's. People who get irritable waiting in line. Is it the cashier's fault? Probably the cashier's doing the best he or she possibly can. So it's more your problem because you only allotted 10 minutes to run into Walmart and get what you needed and get out. And impatience. iPhones have been great with that because people can read the news. Back in the olden days before mobile devices, we just read the little tabloid things that were at the register. Finding things to keep yourself occupied is important. But patience. Part of that goes along with compassion. Not everybody is going to live up to your standards. And on any given day, you may not live up to your own standards. And if you don't, let's look at why. I don't want to say that's okay, give yourself a pass. If you don't live up to your own standards, figure out if you're setting your own standards too high or if there's something else that's going wonky. Which leads us to self-awareness of your current state. How are you? Emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, socially. Impact of others on you. If you're in an environment where you're surrounded by positive, energetic, enthusiastic, optimistic people, that's awesome. Yeah, it's amazing. If you're in an environment where everybody is negative and pessimistic and paranoid, it sucks. It rubs off. So the impact of others on you, you want to be aware of that. Sometimes you're going to be in a work environment where it tends to be more on the negative side. and figuring out how you can shield yourself from that and not, what is it? I'm rubber and you're glue, bounces off me, sticks on you. Make stupid jokes in your head if you have to, in order to get through it. Maybe try to put yourself in that person's head for half a second, and you'll be like, oh, I don't want to be there, that poor thing. Have compassion on those people, but try not to let your emotional boundaries be affected by it. And consider your impact on others. If you walk into a room, do people go, yay? What was it on that old show Cheers when somebody would walk in? I think it was Norm. He would walk down and everybody would be like, Norm! They were so happy to see him. Everybody was jolly. Half-wasted, but jolly nonetheless. If you have a positive impact when you walk into a room, that's a whole different attitude than if you're scary or you're negative or whatever the case may be. And the way you are is probably going to attract people around you similar to that. If I'm a negative Nelly, the positive people are going to get tired of hanging around me and they're going to be like, whatever, give her some space. By the same token, if I am extremely optimistic, the negative people are going to be like, oh, I'm going to get diabetes from how sweet that person's being. So you can control your environment to a certain extent, but if you're in a situation and you start feeling edgy or irritable, look around and figure out, is it you? Or are you picking up on the vibes of other people? I know I've walked into offices before, and I've been like, oh, this looks like a cool place to work. And I've walked into other places before and wanted to turn around and head out as fast as I could because it just felt like everybody was miserable. So have compassion. Even those negative Nellies, I'm sorry, but I can honestly say I would not want to live in their head for more than about 5 minutes because it is such a dark, dismal, desperate place. I'm doing good with alliteration today, aren't I? Instead of getting angry or being irritated, which takes my energy and gives them my power, I tend to choose to have compassion and maybe pity on them, whether that's what they want or not. That's how I personally deal with it. Helping people figure out how they're going to cope with different personalities, because you can't work anywhere. You can't go to a family reunion. And that's one of those big things on holidays. You start talking about, okay, Uncle Bob, the grabby one, is going to come, so how are we going to deal with this? Respect and admiration of self and others. It's easier, I think, to admire others because our culture tends to teach us to admire other people, but admiring ourselves is boastful or vain or I can't think of another word right now. Arrogant, thank you. Prideful. This usually involves a lot of discussion in my groups of what's the line between being arrogant and prideful and just being proud. And is it okay to be proud? Yeah. And generally there's a discussion, and like I've said with other situations before, I'll say, well, if your 10-year-old came in and said this statement about himself, would you tell him to, hush your mouth, you're being prideful? Or would you go, I'm proud of you? Well, if it's okay for your 10-year-old, then why isn't it okay for you? You don't need to rub people's nose in it. But it's okay. Yeah, you don't need to act superior, but to be proud of it. The goals for family recovery: understanding addiction in general, identifying the functions, symptoms, and impacts of addiction in your family. And it's different for every family. In general, addiction helps somebody escape from something that's intolerable. But the way they're escaping, what's intolerable, and what it's going to take for them to deal with life on life's terms is going to be different. My farrier, bless his heart, he works 2 jobs, and he has a 13-year-old who has cerebral palsy and is confined to a wheelchair. It's pretty significant or advanced cerebral palsy. And he always has a good attitude. But the stresses and hurdles and obstacles that he's had to deal with, overcome, or accept are far different than maybe what you've had to deal with or what I've had to deal with. So understanding where the addiction came from. What is it that kind of pushed you over the edge, or what is it that added up to make life overwhelming? Because the interventions are going to be different. Develop a plan to replace addiction with healthier behaviors. When you're triggered, what can you do? We do this relapse prevention planning with our patients individually, but involving the family is really important so the family knows how they can help. When you see your spouse acting really agitated, stressed out, what is it that you can do to help? The last place I worked, and I'd never seen this before and I really liked it, we did a crisis plan at admission where people said, when I'm in crisis, the 3 most effective things you can do are, and the 3 least effective things you can do are, and then here's all my contact information. But it started out at the outset giving us information about what can we do to help you. We want to help people deal with the impact of the addiction on the family. There's a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, guilt, hurt feelings, negative stuff. And there's also probably some financial problems, and there's other things that aren't just emotional. You can't deal with it all at once. So how are you going to deal with this anger? Most instances, I've not seen a couple get together for one couple session and vent what's going on and have it, suddenly resolve and the anger just poof goes away. It would be nice if we could, but it doesn't happen that way. So how are you going to deal with this anger? How are you going to deal with suspiciousness? How are you going to deal with, fill in the blanks that are applicable in your situation? And the impact of the addiction on the family. If Johnny is failing in school now, and you've already ruled out learning disabilities and stuff, and Sally is 16 and pregnant, and there's all kinds of acting out behaviors going on, how are you, the addict and the enabler or codependent, going to work together as the parental units in this particular family to start creating some normalcy? And that's really empowering the people to set aside their labels of addiction and enabler and take on the label of parent and go, okay, I need to step into this role right now and focus on how I'm going to help normalize this family. Part of that is helping them work as a team to create a healthier environment, but encouraging them to be patient and go slow. You can't wake up one morning and say, okay, family meeting. We're going to be perfectly functional now. We're going to share feelings and respect each other and keep promises and be honest and and expect it to work. Start by modeling. Start by setting structure and opening lines of communication. If the first thing you do is just both parental units are consistently there every day, and maybe you can have a meal together or family time, even if maybe a meal's not convenient because Junior has soccer practice. You have family time before bed where everybody spends like 30 minutes in the same room. That's starting to set the precedent. It'll grow from there. You're not going to go from being the Simpsons to being Ward and June Cleaver overnight. So set small goals and make them attainable. We also need to help them understand, if we're working from a strengths-based perspective, what is wellness? If you're taking care of yourself, then you're not engaging in self-defeating or self-destructive behaviors. So if we focus on doing the next right thing, the people are going to be less likely to engage in the addictive behaviors, but it's also going to help them focus on something positive. So what is wellness? Identify the areas needing attention in your family and develop a plan and prioritize these issues. So emotional wellness. That means not only dealing with negative and out of control emotions, but also being able to identify and accept feelings. Teenagers may have more resentment and stuff that they need to figure out how to appropriately get out. The person in recovery may have a whole litany of things. But we also want to say emotional wellness also means being happy. What is it that makes you happy? A lot of people need to have a little bit of time to figure that out because they haven't been happy, like that Lil Wayne song said. They haven't been happy except for when they've been numb for years, so they don't remember what makes them happy. Mental, stinking thinking. Looking at extremes, focusing on the most recent issue instead of looking at the bigger picture. I like doing stinking thinking worksheets because I think it helps people just see things and put things in order. I'm sure there are a lot of different activities that people can do to identify and minimize the stinking thinking. You can also make a game on the family unit that I used to run. We had a jar, and if one of the ladies said a swear word, they had to put a quarter in the jar. At the end of a month, we usually had enough to have a really nice pizza party. But if somebody uses stinking thinking, bless you, they may be challenged to put a quarter in the jar if they're being negative or extreme or fill in the blank. Social wellness, relationships and communication. If you ask somebody, name your 3 best friends, and they look at you like you've got 3 heads, probably need to work on developing relationships because they're too enmeshed. If you have, a husband and wife system that not only is dysfunctional, but it is completely enmeshed, and if that person goes away, they've got no one, that's a problem. They need to have friends that they can call and go shopping with or go fishing with or whatever the case may be. Spiritually, and this, again, can be talking higher power, those sorts of things, but it can also just be talking about values. What guides your life? Are you living with integrity right now? Are you being honest? Are you being purposeful? Are you being compassionate? Physical wellness. This is one area that's kind of easy to start touching all the rest of them because they can make a plan to start getting more healthy as a family. Then they'll all start complaining together as a family. But at least they're talking. At least they're doing something together. Helping people understand that physical fitness doesn't mean necessarily running on the treadmill. It can be taking the dog for a walk or playing frisbee golf, or there's a lot of different things you can do. And occupational and educational wellness. If you're in a job and you're working 40 hours a week, you're preparing for and driving to work another 10 hours a week, and you're driving home another 5 hours, so that's 40, 55. At best, you're spending 55 of your waking hours every week going to your job. If it is not fulfilling, worse yet, if it is negative and sucking the life out of you, what impacts is that having on the rest of your life? How are you engaging with your family when you come home? If you're driving home and you're going, gee, I'd really love to have a drink so I can forget about the day, that's a problem. So we need to look at occupational wellness. Sometimes you're in a profession that just doesn't really fit with your temperament. Maybe you went to college and you became an accountant because your dad's an accountant and you were expected to be an accountant. And you really hate being an accountant. You want to be a personal trainer or figuring out how to make that work or find a compromise is going to be important to your overall happiness, and that's going to bleed into how much energy you have left over to be emotionally and physically available to your family and significant others. Educational wellness, that's more for the kids. If they're in a school or learning environment that's not meeting their needs, or if they're struggling in school, we need to figure out why. We need to help them because constantly getting F's and negative feedback is not going to be helpful. What is it they want to do, and how does this apply to their life? Can't tell you how many times I hear my son say, when am I ever really going to use algebra? I'm like, well, basic algebra you use pretty much every day. Calculus, now I'll have your dad talk to you about that. Helping them understand why it's meaningful to them, how it can be useful. Yes, they have to go to school. There are certain things they have to learn. But if there are other areas they want to grow, by all means, let's kind of encourage them to develop that, and let's model it. My husband, really, he's phenomenal with computers. He reads computer stuff all the time, but he's also into kayaking and hiking and map reading and all kinds of stuff like that. I need a GPS. I'm into gardening and animals and those sorts of things. So we try to model lifelong learning for our kids. And if families can learn together, maybe they're not learning the same thing, but if they can encourage learning and development of each person's creative and intellectual abilities or whatever, self-esteem starts to go up. Do you feel like you're accomplishing something? So having people look and pick which one they're willing to work on first. They're not going to do these overnight. Pick which one you're willing to work on for the month of June. I would bet 75% of the time people start out by saying, patients that I've worked with start out by saying social. They want to work on their relationships and change their mind about a week into it and switch over to physical and try to get their body in better condition, and then they start meeting people at the gym or doing those activities or whatever. But if they start out with social and they don't have any friends, they don't really know where to start. So healthy relationships involve honesty, trust, faith, compassion, and encouragement. These aren't mystical qualities. These are some very basic things that you can go to just about any family. Generally I say if you go to a couple that's been married for 50 years and you say, what is it that kept you going? Most of those, if not all of them, will kind of come up. The other one is perseverance, because the going gets tough sometimes. And perseverance is important because, again, commitment, control, and challenge. You think it's worth maintaining a commitment to it and the energy it's going to take to get through whatever this rough patch is. Assertive communication helps people state their own feelings, needs, and reactions in a positive way. I'm not blaming, I'm not throwing focus, I'm not being ugly about it, I'm just stating what is. Behaviors needed to sustain recovery include self-awareness, willingness, compassion, and persistence. And family recovery involves not only reducing addictive behaviors, but increasing well behaviors. We don't want to strip away all these behaviors and leave them going, what do I do? Start by introducing the well behaviors. Like I said, if they're doing those, they're not going to be doing these. I mean, you can't play basketball with your kid and smoke a joint at the same, well, you can, but most clients who are actually trying for recovery don't. So as you increase that, just the sheer amount of time available for the other stuff goes down. Working with families is challenging. Figuring out the hook to get them engaged. Why is helping your loved one recover important to you? What is the ambivalence? You're here, you think that you still have hope that something can be done. So help me understand what it is from your point of view that you think could change in the next month that might give you hope that this is going to head down a positive path. Don't set long-term goals. What is it that you think that is going to help your loved one be in recovery for the rest of his life? Let's just try to stay clean for the next 30 days and, build on that. Significant others will also generally come in, especially older children and adults, with ideas about what needs to change. So asking, what is it that you think needs to change in your family for things to start going better? What would it look like if the addicted person was not using anymore? Develop visual sort of not really a diorama, but help them get a visualization of what it's going to be like that they can hang on to. So when they close their eyes at night, they can focus on that and go, okay, this is where we're going. We're not there yet, but this is where we're going. So, and that's all we've got for family education and boundaries. Families are a challenge, and unfortunately, I don't think many of us, in terms of treatment centers that I've worked at, do a good job engaging people. The one I worked at in Florida, my first set of mentors, when we did have family education, the people who came got a lot out of it because they were phenomenal. And I still strive to be like them because it was so engaging and so informative, but it was entertaining in the same way. But they are few and far between, finding people who actually do a good job of family education and are able to bring people in. So, all right. Well, it has been a good morning, and like I said, there's some activities that will go back to what the PowerPoints covered and have you talk about or brainstorm some different group activities you might be able to do to tailor it to something that would work more effectively in your facility based on the setting that you have and the population that you have. So, all right. Well, have a great rest of the week.